Every time I dig in the garden, I learn something new. And the funny thing is, those lessons don't just stay in the garden. They sneak their way into the house and completely change the way I look after my houseplants.
One of the biggest lessons I've picked up recently has to do with soil and roots, the very foundations of plant care.
But it turns out the things we've been told for years might not be helping us as much as we think.
If you've spent even 5 minutes on the internet looking up plant advice, then you'll have heard something like, keep your plant in a pot that isn't too big, or always repot into a pot that's no more than 2 sizes larger. It's one of those golden rules that gets repeated so often that people stop questioning it. But after a year of serious gardening, I'm starting to think that this small pot's the best thing is exactly the type of advice that might actually be holding our plants back.
And what made me question it all? Sunflowers. Now, if you've never grown sunflowers, let me tell you, they're a lot to handle.
They want space to stretch their legs, food in their belly, and as much vitamin D as they can get their big old head to lap up. So I grew a bunch of them this year, with some going into pots and some going into my raised beds. And here's where it got interesting. Well, for me anyway.
Check out the fellas in the raised beds. Absolute monsters. These are Titan sunflowers, and they sure do live up to the name. I'm 6'6", and these guys absolutely tower over me. And look at the thick stems and dinner plate sized leaves. I can't imagine what the flowers are going to look like when they finally come out. And then we have these. Let's just say they didn't get the Titan memo. Shorter and skinnier with a bit too much yellowing for my liking. These guys are more like Tiny Tim rather than Titan. Now, I'm not a botanist, but the difference was so obvious it was almost embarrassing. The raised bed sunflowers had all the space in the world to stretch their legs and go digging for nutrients, while the potted ones were trying to grow tall but kept hitting a plastic wall every time they tried.
So yeah, the mistake I made wasn't bad soil or bad light, it was the pots. I simply didn't give them enough room to show me what they were capable of.
It's not just sunflowers either. The same thing happened with my cherry tomatoes. I grew some in some decent sized containers and some went into my raised bed again, and the difference was night and day. The ones with more root room had lush deep green leaves and were full of energy and life, while the others looked like they'd been dragged through a hedge backwards. And suddenly, I was looking at my houseplants differently. Take this guy for example, one of my slower growers indoors. He's always been a bit stingy with the new leaves. And when I pull his trousers down and check out his private parts, this is what I see. A full-on spaghetti party, circling around and round, desperately trying to find space that just isn't there.
So, this is my big aha moment. The same thing holding back my sunflowers and tomatoes is probably happening to my houseplants. But then, in the back of my head, I can still hear the familiar chorus of plant advice. Only go up 1 pot size and never give them too much space. To be honest, I think I'm over it.
That rule might make sense if you're brand new to plants and still learning how to water properly, because yeah, if you've got a huge pot full of soil that stays wet for weeks, you can drown a plant pretty easily.
But if you know what you're doing, and because you're watching this, I'm guessing you do, then why keep following the rules that limit your plant's potential instead of helping them thrive?
So I'm breaking the rule. This guy isn't getting 1 size bigger. He's getting as much space as I can give him so his roots can actually stretch out instead of tying themselves into a pretzel.
If you're sick of having to repot your monstera every 6 months because it keeps outgrowing its container, maybe it's not that your plant is difficult, maybe it's that the advice you've been following is designed to keep you stuck in that endless cycle of repotting.
The key is to just let the soil dry out properly between waterings. That way you don't end up with a swampy pot that smells like something Shrek would be proud to live in.
The more I think about it, the more I see how this lesson from the garden applies indoors. In the garden, plants don't sit there worrying about whether the soil is too big for them.
They don't measure out neat little increments, they just grow. They send roots down wherever they want, tapping into pockets of nutrients, chasing after water, building this amazing underground network that supports everything you see above the soil. Why shouldn't our houseplants get the same chance?
One of the most surprising lessons the garden handed me this year came when I started planting out a bunch of new things. Some of them settled in straight away, happy as Larry, throwing out fresh leaves and looking like they'd lived there forever.
But then there were the others, the strugglers. They sat there sulking, barely putting on any new growth, and in a couple of cases they started to decline almost from the moment I planted them.
It was baffling because on paper I've done everything the same. So why were some thriving while others looked like they were already halfway to the compost bin?
I did what every gardener does in this situation. I blame the weather. Too wet, too dry, too hot, too cold. The British summer is an easy scapegoat. As time went on, the pattern became too obvious to ignore, so I started to look closer.
On the happy plants, the base, where the stems meet the roots, which is called the crown by the way, looked clean and healthy.
On the struggling ones, something different was happening. The soil was sitting higher up around the stems, almost hugging them, and when I brushed it back, I could see the start of soft, dark patches. The plants weren't failing because of the weather, they were failing because I'd planted them too deep.
It sounds like such a tiny detail, but it makes all the difference. When the crown is buried, moisture collects right where the plant is most vulnerable, and we start running into problems with rot.
But the ones I'd left sitting just slightly higher, or what fancy gardeners call proud of the soil, never had that problem. The base stayed dry and the air could circulate no problemo.
And thinking about this is the exact same danger we face indoors. I mean, how many times have you repotted a plant and felt tempted to cover up that gnarly base with a nice fresh layer of soil?
Looks tidier, doesn't it? But what you're actually doing is the same mistake I made in the garden, burying the crown and holding moisture against the part of the plant that can't handle it.
Bury them too deep and we risk them rotting from the base up. Keep them sitting a little proud above the soil line and they stay far healthier.
If you've been following me for any length of time, then you'll know I'm a big advocate of pruning.
I go on about it all the time with houseplants because it makes such a dramatic difference. But gardening has really hammered that point home for me this year. It's one thing to say that pruning helps, and it's another to see just how much a plant can give you when you're brave enough to Edward Scissorhand it.
Take deadheading for example. I've grown cosmos this year for the very first time, and if you leave them to it, the flowers don't last that long. They put on a pretty show, then they're off, and before you know it, the plant is pouring all its energy into making seed instead of more flowers. But the second you snip off those dead blooms, the plant says, right then, time for round two. And suddenly you've got a fresh flush of colour, and the plant keeps blooming for weeks longer than it would have done on its own. And roses are the same. Keep gutting, keep deadheading, and they keep rewarding you with flower after flower. And then there's structural pruning. My camellia and bay tree both taught me this lesson the hard way. Left alone, they grow pretty tall and leggy. By cutting them back early, you encourage side shoots to branch out. You don't just get a taller plant, you get a fuller one.
And pruning isn't only about shaping or prolonging flowers, it can actually reinvigorate a plant that's starting to look a bit tired.
A good example is my salvia. 2 weeks ago he was looking scruffy, so I pruned him right down at the base. It did feel brutal at the time, but already new shoots are pushing through fresh and green. They're coming back stronger than ever.
Seeing that kind of response outside has completely reinforced to me how powerful pruning is indoors, because the same principles apply to houseplants.
If you let them grow unchecked, most houseplants just keep stretching up, chasing the light, and leaving you with lanky stems and sparse leaves. But pinch back the tips and suddenly the plant redirects its energy into branching. I know it can feel scary the first time you do it. Cutting off perfectly healthy growth feels counterintuitive, doesn't it? But once you've seen the results, you start to trust the process.
One of the clearest lessons the garden taught me this year didn't come from my successes, but from my failures. And once again, it was the tomatoes that delivered the reality check.
I have had a good season of growing tomatoes. This is actually my first, and it's been fun. Mrs. Sheffield planted about 100 of them in spring, but that's a story for another day. But it has been great picking perfectly ripe fruit from a homegrown plant. Seems to taste better. Anyway, things were going great guns, but recently things are starting to change. Gradually the leaves are turning blotchy and some of them are looking a bit of a mess. It looks to me like some sort of disease has taken hold and not letting go.
I'm not absolutely heartbroken about this because we have had lots of harvests already, but it did get me wondering why this is happening suddenly. And then I realised the weather has changed and maybe, just maybe, I've been a bit slapdash with the hose.
You see, we had an unusually dry spring here in Sheffield and the tomatoes absolutely loved it, but recently it's been a bit rainier and this seems to have done a number on my tomato plants.
Add to the fact that sometimes when I was in a rush with the hose, I'd splash water over the whole plant instead of slowing down and aiming it at the base. So I've been setting them up for trouble.
Warm weather plus damp foliage equals the perfect breeding ground for disease. I might as well have been rolling out the red carpet for it.
It might sound a bit silly, but this same principle applies indoors. Granted, there shouldn't be the same spores flying around indoors as there are in the garden, but stagnant air and excess moisture are a recipe for disaster.
Even pests like fungus gnats thrive when you create that damp, stagnant environment by watering carelessly. So, I've been extra vigilant about keeping the leaves dry and watering where it actually matters. That's where the magic happens after all, and where the plant can absorb it properly. The leaves don't need a shower. One thing I never really thought about until I started gardening was the effect of wind on plants. Out in the garden, you can actually see how a breeze toughens them up. It encourages them to grow thick stems with deep roots that anchor more deeply, and the whole plant becomes sturdier. Compare that to a plant kept in still air, and it's clear which one can handle a bit of stress. So that got me wondering about my houseplants, because indoors they never get that natural workout.
So I started experimenting, and it worked so well that I made a whole video about it which you can watch right here. I'll see you there.